It's time, my friends, it's time. We're back. And now we're going to take a look at the Lorenz curve. The Lorenz curve, for me, is like the genius diagram of macroeconomics. I know I've been talking about the neoclassical rule of 10 and the Keynesian rule of 9 of being so generous and giving and all this stuff. But in terms of like, man, someone thought of this curve? Someone like really developed this curve? And like, man, it's pretty much amazing. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you one. I'm going to use data from Jocelyn Blink and Ian Dorton's IB Economics Course Companion, which I've been using for the basis of most of all of this microeconomic or macroeconomic bundle. And I'll go through it, and then we'll talk about what it means. Okay, so take a look at this. There it is. There it is. Wah! The Lorenz curve. It makes you want to have another sip of mate and just admire it for a second, because you're about to get your mind blown by the simplicity in which this diagram expresses and shows the different levels of inequity in a particular country. Okay, so first things first. Okay, now just go with me on this. Of course, you got the associated videos or the notes associated with this video, and you got these slides also. But I think right now, don't be taking any notes. Just be sitting here watching. Okay. So what is the Lorenz curve? Well, the Lorenz curve is taking a look at the relationship between the cumulative, very important, cumulative percentage. Cumulative percentage. So cumulative means you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? So cumulative percentage of what? Of total income in a particular country. So we're going from 0 to 20%, 40%, 60, 80, 100%. Okay? Cumulative percentage of income. Great. Not dollars amount or not in terms of like counting it, but percentage of income. In relation to the cumulative percentage of total population. So this is 20% of the population, 40%, 60%, 80%, 100%. Okay. You got that? Sweet. So if you go to the top of the graph up here, you see that you will get to a point where you will account for 100% of the people in a country and 100% of the money. Sweet. That makes sense. Okay. So, good. Now, don't look at anything else. Just listen to where I'm going to take us next. Okay. So if you start at 0, that would be 0% of total income and 0% of total population. Yeah. Then what you would then do if you followed this blue line, at 20% of the people, you would find 20% of the income if there were absolute equality in income in a country, right? Well, that makes sense. So if it's absolute equality, let's say there are 10 people in a room, right? And you go to the first 2 people. If it were absolute equality, let's say there are $100 in the room, you go to the first 2 people, you would find $20. If you go to the next 2 people, now you have a cumulative percentage of 40% of the people in the income, in the economy, in the country. And as a result, if it's perfectly equal distribution of income or absolute equality, you're going to find 40% of the money. Then 60% of the money with 6 people, 80 with 8 people, and then 100% with all the money, right? With all the people, rather. Okay, so that's what this line is here. This line represents the line of absolute equality. And from the line of absolute equality, we get, guess what? Right? That. Okay? So, as we go through this, you are going to now see something that is a reference point for equality. If a country had perfect distribution of income, then you would find, if you went through 20% of the people and you looked in their pockets, you'd find 20% of the money. If you went through 40% of the people, you would find 40% of the money. 60%, you find 60% of the money. 80%, 80% of the money. 100%, 100% of the money. Now you can very easily see Croatia and Brazil right here. And you can see that that's not really going to be the case. Okay? But before we get to that, one other thing that I find really helpful for students is for them to focus on something that I call the triangle of absolute equality. And that triangle is right here. Okay? You see that blue triangle? You see that blue triangle? I can make it a little bit thicker. Watch this. Oh, isn't that cool? Okay. This triangle right here is the triangle of total equality. The reason that's important is that the Lorenz curve is related to something called the Gini index or the Gini coefficient. And what we're going to see is there's a relationship between the area of that blue triangle and the amount and the area that's left over after we look at the data from a particular country. And that ratio right there will create something known as the Gini coefficient or the Gini index. We'll hold off on that, but just the line of absolute equality creates this fictitious triangle of absolute equality, okay? Cool. Now, let's look at some realities, okay? Now look at Brazil. Now Brazil is this green line right here. What is that? We're going to look at the data the next slide, but what does this show us? This shows us that in Brazil, if you found 20%, the lowest 20% of the population is going to have nothing, like 3% of the money in their pockets, right? What about if you went to the lowest 40% of Brazilian society, how much money would you find? Of the total income, you'd only find 10% of the income. So in the lower 40% of Brazil, you'll only find 10% of the total income earned in that country. What if you got 60% of the people together, the lowest 60% of society, you would only find 20% of the total income in the economy. If you found the 80%, if you got the lowest 80% of the population, you would only find 40% of all income, which means that this last 20%, this last 20%, oh my goodness gracious, they have 60% of all of the income in Chile. In Chile. I live in Chile. In Brazil. Okay? Wow, that's pretty cool. That is very, very cool. Okay? Super cool. All right, now let's look at Croatia. Now Croatia, we'll look at the data in a second, but just go along. It's really helpful. What does Croatia look like? What's the inequity in Croatia like? Well, the Lorenz curve, you can already see just by looking at this, right? You can already see by looking at this that Croatia must be a little bit more towards equally distributed income than Brazil. Why? Well, because it's between Brazil and the line of absolute equality. Pretty cool. So Croatia, the lowest 20% would have about 10% of the income. The lowest 40% would have 20% of the income. The lowest 60%, and you would find 40% of all income if you got the lowest 60% of income earners in Croatia together. If you got 80% of the lowest income earners, you would actually find 60% of all the income. Not too bad. Not too bad at all. And then, of course, the last 20%, the wealthiest of the people of Croatia, do have 40% of all of the income. Okay. So, watch this. So, what can we draw from this? Well, what I want you to think about is this is just a device a device for remembering. If there were a country that had perfect distribution of income, then it would fill up this entire area of the blue triangle. Does that make sense? So let me say it a different way. This triangle right here represents 1. There, now I said it. Represents 1, okay? So if you look at the area between this red line and the blue line of absolute equality, you would see that actually Croatia makes up a very nice proportion of that whole blue triangle, whereas Brazil does not, okay? So remember that. I'm going to go to the next slide and we're going to take a look at the data that comes from this thing called the Gini coefficient or the Gini index, which we'll look at in the next video. But that'll really help you understand exactly what is going on. Okay, so here we have it now, right? The same exact diagram, but now we're going to take a look at some data, okay? So we have data from Bolivia, Brazil, Croatia, and Madagascar. Now, ignore Madagascar and Bolivia for now. We are going to take a look at, of course, Brazil, right? That's this one right here, this data. And, oh, no, that's the wrong color. We're going to take a look at Brazil, which is green. Okay, let's take a look at that first. All right. So Brazil, I said that the 20% is going to have about 3% of the income. That's true, right? What about the next 40%? The 40% of the income, 40% of the population, remember it's cumulative, has about 7% of the income. 60% has about 11% of all income. Okay, you're going to add this up. If you added this plus that, you get 10 plus 11, and you'd end up at 20%. Okay, now the top 80, the lowest 80% is now going to get another 19% of the income. So 3 plus roughly 7 plus 12 plus 20 is roughly 40, right? And then the last 20% of Brazil has what? Nearly 60% of all the income, and there's the number. All right. Cool. You got that? All right. Now, add that. We'll take a look now at Croatia. Okay. I know I just did this, but it's helpful to look through it. There's Croatia. And now let's take a look at Croatia with the data. 8% after 20% of the population. 40% of the population, we're going to find another 13%. So you add that together, that's 20%. 60% of the population, you're going to add, that's another up to 40%. So that must be around another 20% of money, and it is. Then up to 80% of the people, and you'll find 60% of the money. You add another 22, you add 8 plus 13 plus 17 plus 22, and you'll get something close to 60%. Sweet. Then you can check it. So this must be approximately 40% of all income must be in the last 20% of the Croatian population. And indeed it is. Okay. Now, that makes sense. Okay. Now, what I really want you to take a look at here are those numbers right there. Okay. So remember, this is how you are going to remember the Gini index. Remember this line of absolute equality and this triangle right here. Yeah. What you are going to look at is what percentage of this triangle, yeah, is between the line of absolute equality and the actual line that you draw. Okay? And the actual line that you draw. What is the distance between this line of Brazil and absolute equality? Okay? What percentage of this blue triangle does Brazil actually take up if you were to look at the distance between that line and there, that line in there, that line in there? You could look at it and say, well, that's about half. And guess what? You're right. It's about half, or 55%. Okay? So the Gini index is a look at the relationship between the distribution of income and what would be perfect. Okay? So, therefore, the higher the number, the more unequal it is. The higher the number, the more unequal it is. Because, as you can imagine, if there were a country that had a Gini index, or rather, sorry, a Lorenz curve that looked like this, that would take up a higher percentage of the blue triangle. And therefore, the Gini index for this line right here, this fictitious black country that I just added, that Gini index would be higher than Brazil's. And therefore, it makes sense that Croatia, which is this red line, the area between the line of absolute equality and Croatia, that looks like it's about 25% of the overall blue triangle. And lo and behold, yeah, okay, it's 29%. So maybe 30%, right? So this is really, really important to you as you get to the Gini coefficient, because you can get this so twisted. Because normally when a number is higher, we think of it as better. But actually, with the Gini coefficient, if you look at this, the higher the number, the more unequal it is. This black line right here represents a country that has a more disproportionate, unequal distribution of income than Brazil. And Croatia has a more even distribution than Brazil does. So therefore, this is only 30% of the total blue triangle. the green is about 50%, and this black one would be about 70%. And so the higher the Gini index, the closer it gets to 1, because it's always like, well, this is an index, so put it in percentage. But if you just look at the coefficient, it would be like 0.55 or 0.29 or 0.70. So the closer the number gets to 0 for the Gini coefficient, the more unequal the distribution of income is in a country. And you can know that because you understand now that what that means is that this area from the black line to the blue line is larger, therefore closer to 1, than it is for the green line in Brazil or the red line and Croatia. Okay? That's going to help you so much. If you don't understand that, rewind and get it in your head. Okay? Excellent. Last slide. All right. So the key point here is that the line of equality is for comparison. The blue line does not exist, right? It's a way of comparing the relative distribution of income in a country to the ideally perfectly evenly distributed income in society, where 20% of the population would have 20% of the income. That doesn't exist anywhere. But a country that had a line, a Gini coefficient, that was between Croatia and the line of absolute equality would be more equal. And you already know that just from looking at this diagram. And also, you know that the Gini coefficient for that country that's represented by the yellow line would be smaller than 0.29. It would be something like, 0.2 or 20% if it's an indexed number. Okay? So therefore, last point, I've already said this, the greater the distance from the line of equality, the more unequally income is distributed in the economy. Okay, so if you put multiple countries on here, you can see the income in Brazil is more unequally distributed than it is for Croatia. And if you got that, killer. We're moving on. We'll see you in the next video, my friends. The Gini coefficient, where all of this just goes whoop and comes right together, and you're going to be able to dominate this information no matter what the assessment you're given is in class. And we'll see you there.